All right, it's good to see you this evening. We're going to enter a brief, relatively brief study over the next couple of weeks as an interim to Kyle leading this class and teaching this class for the last 8 weeks of the quarter. I was surprised to see Kyle tonight. I thought that he was going to be out, but he's here. But over the next several weeks, with polishing the pulpit and some summer series that are not aligned on the calendar with our summer series process and the quarter breaks that we use, he's going to be away. And so I'm going to be kind of between a rock and a hard place, so to speak, between what took place in our summer series, which was great success in my opinion. From my view, I was very encouraged, solid lessons, great speakers. And then our minister Kyle coming behind the scenes. I'm kind of in that rock and hard place, but you are too. And so hopefully you'll bear with me and we'll make some productive use of the time that we're going to be spending in. I'm excited about Kyle's study. That study is going to focus on the life of the prophet Elijah, which is a rich study. Lots of very, I think, applicable lessons for all of us, certainly for me. So I'm excited about that particular study. What we're going to do between now and then is we're going to consider the lives of 4 men in Scripture. You know, at different times and in specific seasons of life, we find ourselves struggling. We might be struggling with the affairs and the events of life in the particular stage that we're in. Some of us might actually be struggling with God and our understanding of God and what His will is for us in any set of circumstances that we're dealing with. It's often in these moments of struggle that we come to better understand our place and recognize His sovereignty and His goodness more deeply than we appreciate when we're not in those challenging circumstances. And so given that backdrop, we're going to explore the lives tonight of Jacob, next week, Lord willing, Job. The following week, we're going to maybe revisit and rehash some things that Aubrey shared with us. It was interesting that found out after kind of setting the course for this particular study that he was going to preach on Habakkuk. And so we're going to talk about Habakkuk again a little bit. And then, Lord willing, we'll conclude with a study of the Apostle Paul and focus more so on his struggle with God as Saul. Each of these men faced profound struggles in their walk, in their lives, that involved God and God's place in their lives. And their stories offer some very relatable experiences. And so we're going to try to use those as we consider we consider what it means to surrender to God, because each of these men ended up in surrender. But there's this great paradox that happens in that when we surrender to God, we become victorious. We have the ability to master or better master those circumstances with the power of God working with us as we better understand our place and His sovereignty. So with all that said, we're going to focus our attention this evening, in the time remaining, on Jacob. Very rich potential for study and a familiar study to us, but maybe a slightly different angle than we've gone before, maybe not. As I think about this particular study, again, there's been several things that have led me to think about this and do this at this time. I've read several books of late. I've listened to a couple of podcasts that reference this idea of wrestling with or struggling with God. As I think about wrestling, I can remember Saturday evenings in my childhood at my mother's parents' home, my grandparents. The grandfather in that particular family was known as Pop to me. It's Mom and Pop. And I happened to be Pop for my grandkids. in some ways tied back to that good memory. But my grandfather, Pop, he was born and raised down in Middle Georgia in the Barnesville area, Zebulon area, and the regular practice for him, at least during the times that I got to spend with him on a Saturday evening, is he was sitting in front of the television and he was watching Georgia Championship Wrestling. It happened to be that the only room in that farmhouse that was air conditioned was the TV room, the sitting room, and Gordon Soley and all those crazy wrestlers from Georgia, and I'm convinced that my grandfather, he thought that was not entertainment, but real live sporting events and activities, but I do have fond memories of being in that room and watching those wrestling matches and whatnot. And it's amazing that we have a reference to a wrestling match in Scripture, and we're going to talk about that this evening relative to Jacob. And so we're going to spend most of our time in the book of Genesis tonight, Genesis chapter 25. We'll read some of these passages we're going to refer to, given the familiarity of the story and the tightness of our time that we have together, but we're going to read some things this evening. Let's turn over to Genesis chapter 25. That's where we're introduced originally to Jacob, and where we find out some information about him and his life. Beginning in chapter 25, beginning in verse 21, we read there, "And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her. And she said, 'If it is time, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples are within you, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them." All right, so we're introduced initially to Jacob. Now, Jacob was a struggler. He was struggling. He was wrestling before he was even born, which is amazing. So much so, in the original language, the nature of what was taking place in Rebekah's womb, the literal language, the literal translation of the struggle that's happening is a crashing, a cracking, almost like a cracking of bones. I mean, there's some significant struggling going on in her womb, and she goes to God looking for answers, and God answered her. There are 2 nations, and those nations are going to be divided. The older will serve the younger. Jacob's name was given to him, and it has to do with that grabbing of the heel. He is a supplanter, one who supplants, one who attempts to take the place of. And often, and we see this play out in his life, as a result of treachery, trickery, deception. It's one who takes the place of. And certainly in the next couple of verses, we're not going to read those. You're familiar, though, with the rivalry that was extant in that home. There were rivalries and favorites that were being meted out that contributed to this mix, this environment. And later in his life, later in this chapter, we read about the seizing of the birthright. So Jacob seizes and takes the birthright opportunistically. Later, he goes on to take the blessing. Now, relative to that birthright and blessing, two things that Esau, being the oldest, had a right to. Esau, we see, he's very short-minded. He's very temporal. He's a man in the field, and he comes out of the field and comes home one day and some of his apparently favorite stew is being prepared, and he is willing to trade his birthright for a literal bowl of stew. Now, what kind of short-term thinking that is, it's amazing to me. It also brings to mind a bit of a funny story. I've got a grandson who's the oldest in his family, and his last name's not Burnett, so it's not Henry, it's not that one. But it's funny in a conversation, not about this lesson per se, but when hearing a reference to the birthright, he said, I remember I'm the one who's going to have the birthright, but what is it? What is it? So an impression's been made on him, and my commendations to those who are teaching our children in our Bible school program and those that are involved in Sunflower Preschool. You're teaching lessons that are having an impact on my grandchildren, which I'm thankful for, but all of the children that are a part of those programs and are benefited. But here, again, we've got a short-term thought process by Esau, and Jacob is willing to opportunistically take, he's willing to take that birthright. But later, he goes to some extremes to take the blessing that he was due as the oldest. He schemes with his mother, as you're familiar with that story, to steal that blessing. And the taking of that blessing in particular, although I'm sure there's some tie back to the struggles that these brothers likely had throughout their lives, that stealing of the blessing really fuels Esau's anger towards Jacob. Esau began planning his revenge. In fact, so much so he was thinking about and contemplating taking his own brother's life, but made a decision to wait until his father passed before he meted out that revenge that he wanted to take on his brother. So it's in that circumstance where it's clear Esau is wanting to bring about Jacob's end, that Rebekah and then later Isaac use to basically send Jacob away to find a wife, to leave, to provide some separation between he and Esau, but also to go back home. Esau had made some bad decisions, in particular a bad decision about securing a wife from some pagan peoples around, and so that was causing some heartache for his parents, and they determined that with Jacob they were going to try to have him find a wife from the clan. And so that brings us to Genesis chapter 28. And it's interesting that as we encounter Jacob leaving home, there's a bookend of events that happen as he's leaving and heading out on his journey, and then as he returns from his journey that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. There is two profound encounters with God that occur and that take place. Okay? Before he begins and goes on that journey, Isaac does call Jacob into him, and he blesses him, and he directs him to go and find a wife from the family, not from Canaan. And he asks for God's blessing on that process. So that, again, brings us to Genesis 28, and is covered in 28. Let's begin in verse 10, though, as Jacob is on his way to find that wife. Beginning in verse 10, Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give you and your offspring. Your offsprings will be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. God encounters Jacob here as he's beginning this journey. Jacob is isolated when God encounters him. He's all alone, and he experiences this incredible dream. In that dream, as we're familiar with it, as we just read, there's a ladder that's connecting heaven and earth. Yahweh, the Lord, all caps, Yahweh, is above that ladder in heaven, and he's speaking. Angels are seen moving up and down on that ladder, carrying on the work of God. Now, in the New Testament, with the call of Nathanael of Cana, Jesus references this very dream as he's talking to Nathanael, and that's found over in the book of John. Let's turn over there real quick, John chapter 1. We're going to read some other passages from John chapter 1 in just a little while, but John chapter 1, beginning in verse 45, again, I think a familiar passage to us. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, and when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man," referring to, obviously, himself. Jesus is the ladder that connects heaven and earth. Now, Jacob awakes from his dream and he reacts. He reacts with great awe, being in the presence of God. He's surprised that God was in that place. He changes the name of that place to Bethel, a compound word meaning God's home or the home of God, house of God. And he responds to those promises that we just read a minute ago that God had given to him with a vow. And so again, back in Genesis chapter 28, if we begin in verse 20, there we read, "Then Jacob made a vow saying, 'If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again in my father's home in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And all of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you.'" So based on this encounter, Jacob vows to follow this God and to give to this God in this particular vow. That stone that he pillowed his head on has been raised now as an Ebenezer, as a memorial to the promises that God made to him and his vow back to God. Now, although he didn't know it at the time, Jacob was introduced to Jesus in that encounter, because Jesus is that ladder that God has chosen to use to bring together heaven and earth. There's an incredible series of events that continue in the life of Jacob over the next 20 years. So he's introduced to Jesus. This struggle that he's been involved in is going to continue. And there's an incredible series of events, again, that takes place. He meets his future wife. He's deceived and marries her sister after 7 years of indentured servitude. He agrees to work another 7 years for his bride. Through that time, he's taken advantage of by his father-in-law, Laban. And yet, in spite of all of those circumstances and all those difficulties, God blesses him and continues to bless him. He grows a family. He amasses great wealth in a variety of ways and means. And so that's kind of the first encounter, and then this 20-year period ensues. But that then brings us over to Genesis chapter 32 for this second bookended encounter in the life of Jacob. And so he's just come to an understanding and agreement with his father-in-law. He's returning home, and he's anticipating the difficult reunion and the potential for that to even result in his losing his life relative to his brother Esau and what precipitated his departure 20 years before. And so beginning in verses 1 and then running down through verse 8 of chapter 32, we see very clearly that as Jacob is coming back, God is involved. God's involved. God sends his messengers to meet Jacob as Jacob is coming back. And I can't help but think about how God is seeking, even today, God is seeking Jacob. But throughout Scripture, we see God seeking. Jesus said that his mission was to come and seek and save the lost. Jesus, speaking to that woman at the well, said that God is seeking true worshipers. God is seeking. And God was seeking Jacob in this time. And it's interesting, Jacob, if you look there, and I think it's in verses 1 and 2, the angels of God meet him, and when Jacob sees them, he says, "This is God's camp." This is God's camp. And he calls the name of the place Mahanaim, which in Hebrew means two camps. So some commentators suggest that this is illustrative of the fact that there's a reference to two camps is illustrative of the numbers of servants and family members and possessions that Jacob is returning with. Whereas some suggest that this is an indication that Jacob is not aligned with God's camp. There are two camps. There's God's camp, and there's my camp. I can't, I'm not sure all that's going on here, but based on the way things play out, I think it's pretty clear at this point, and we'll talk about this further in a minute, that Jacob is not fully on board and aligned with God. He's not fully submitted yet to God. Whatever the case is, he is returning. He has his own camp. God has his camp. There are two camps. And as a result of this interaction, Jacob sends emissaries, he sends messengers on to Esau to meet Esau. He fears greatly Esau and the revenge that he anticipates Esau wanting to mete out on him. If you look down in verse 6, I think it is, there's a return of some of these messengers that Jacob has sent off to talk with his brother Esau. They come back and tell him, hey, Esau's coming to meet you, and he's got 400 men with him. And Jacob's stress level and his anxiety increases. It's on the uptick. And I think we can understand why. What's interesting is that after that news and his distress, notice what he does. He separates his camp. If this is a great, with all of his servants and his family and the wealth, he's trying to incrementalize. He's fragmenting himself. He's not massing. He's separating. Now let's look at verses 9 through 12. I mean, again, I talked about me being between a rock and a hard place. You need to see Jacob is in that place. He wants to come home. He knows that God has said he's going to bless him in this home, but he's worried about his brother and what's going to happen. So if we look at beginning in verse 9, we'll read down through verse 12. And Jacob said, and this is Jacob, the first recorded prayer that we see that he utters here. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come back and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you have said, I will surely do you good, and I will make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. We have a prayer, and a prayer of humility that I think is evidencing some changes with Jacob. But notice some subtleties here. Notice how he addresses God. He addresses God as the God of my fathers. I think that's an appropriate address. But we see later in the next chapter, I'll steal a little bit of thunder as we're going to wrap up in a little while here. He references, after having worshiped God, having been reunited and reconciled to Esau, and moving forward from that, he offers worship to God and references the altar that he constructs to offer that worship to God and memorializes that as the altar of the God of Isaac. I'm sorry, not the God of Isaac, the God of Israel, which is going to be his new name. So he takes possession later in this story. Here, there's a little bit of distance. It's the God of my fathers. And so that's something to note there. He reminds God of the promises that were made to him in that initial dream. And he asks for deliverance from Esau. It's clear that he is stressed and he's approaching God. Maybe he feels like he has nowhere else to go. But we see what follows. So beginning in verse 13 and reading down through verse 21 here in this chapter, it seems to be that he's falling back on kind of some self-reliance. Notice in verse 13, I mentioned some bookends a minute ago. There's some bookends in this reading as well. Verse 13 says, so he stayed there that night. Okay? And then in verse 21, so the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. And then verse 22, that same night. This is one night, and there are a lot of things that are going on in this night. He's not sleeping well this night, the night before he's going to meet Esau. He's appealed to God for salvation. But notice what he does. In those verses that follow verse 13, he begins compiling a present, an appeasement, a sacrifice, if you will, that he is going to deliver and offer to his brother to try to assuage his anger. This is an appeasement plan. If you look down, I think it's in verse 20 specifically, it says there, he thought, I may appease him. That is, Jacob thought he might appease his brother Esau with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I will see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. This idea of seeing his face is very much the same kind of language that the Hebrews would use relative to Jewish worship and seeing the face of God. The idea of atonement and becoming one with God. he is valuing and putting more fear into being right with his brother Esau than in relying on the God of heaven to deliver him in this circumstance. And so I want you to see that rub here. He's having a hard time sleeping. In verse 22, we see that he separates himself. He places his family on the opposite side of this stream, Jabbok, which has some lingual references again to this idea of struggling. But he puts his family on the other side, and he again is isolated. He's by himself. He's fragmented. He's broken his group, into smaller and smaller groups or waves, if you will. He left Canaan with nothing, as he said in his prayer. I left with this staff in my hand, and that's all that I had, and I've come back with all this wealth. Well, he doesn't have any of that right now. I mean, he's separated himself, and he's alone, and he's by himself. So with that said, let's begin in verse 22. We want to read about this wrestling match that happens. The same night, again, he's not sleeping very much here. He's figuring out what he's going to give to his brother and still kind of scheming in that way as he's done in the past. Verse 22, that same night he arose, he took his 2 wives and 2 female servants and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of joint, so as he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you've striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. All right, so we see the account here that he wrestles with this man. He wrestles with this man all night. And during the contest, his hip was put out of joint and apparently walks with a limp the rest of his life. As we think about strength, and we'll talk in a minute as we make some applications here, but as we think about, encountering another and fighting with another, our core and our hips are vitally important in terms of any sort of physical encounter like the one that's described here. And he's immobilized as a result of that. I couldn't help but think about a movie from my childhood, the Karate Kid. I know they've made several remakes, but you think about that situation with Daniel-san, fighting in the contest and having an injury and going after that injury to end the match, right? That match ends, and again we'll talk about this in a minute. But it's an interesting insight that we see what brought about the end of this particular contest. Now, in light of the significance of this event, we see that Jacob not only receives a new name, but he renames the place where this occurred. And the meaning of that name is shared with us there. I saw God face to face. So there are lots of thoughts, lots of commentators that have written about, we see a reference to a man. Here he's naming the place on the basis of seeing God face to face. The prophet Hosea in Hosea chapter 12, verses 2 through 4, references in a prophetic sense not only the nation of Israel, but the man Israel and what happened on this particular night, and suggests that he did wrestle with the angel of God. And so there's a lot of different commentators, a lot of different references here. And I think there's room because we don't know for sure exactly because of all of these various references. But God was clearly involved in this process. As we said before, God was seeking. God met Jacob with messengers as he entered this particular place. And it was in this encounter that we see this happening. And I'll tell you, I do believe there are a number of what are referenced as theophanies in the Old Testament, manifestations of potentially God himself, Jesus as part of the Godhead. We see references to the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament that are not referenced in the New Testament. And so I do think it's very plausible that Jesus himself was introduced to Jacob in the dream involving the ladder and has now been involved perhaps in this contest that takes place with him overnight. So that's kind of a backstory, the backstory of Jacob. We were familiar with those stories, but we wanted to draw some of those ideas in place. And now let's turn and talk a little bit about the struggle and try to genericize or draw out some applications that I think might be relevant for us. And one that I think is really important, at least to me, as I think about this and try to step back from the detail, is I think in the story arc of every one of our lives as creatures created in the image of God, as we come of age, there is a deep and a personal struggle that takes place in our lives relative to authority. Who are we going to serve? Are we going to serve ourselves? Are we going to serve someone else? There's a natural tension that comes about in the home. You know, having been the father of teens, those magnets that draw us together flip. And there's a period of time where there's some repelling and some tension that I think naturally happens. Before there was a mother and father, earlier in the book of Genesis, we hear about leaving. That's God's plan. Before there was a mom and dad, leaving the home was a part of God's plan. Now, it's not good for man to be alone. That's there too, and so there's that potential for cleaving as well. But leaving is a part of God's plan. Ambition, finding ourselves, finding what we're good at, looking at ourselves at the mirror, understanding culpability, responsibility, accountability, personal accountability. At some point in all of our lives, we become accountable. All of the circumstances, all of the bad things that have happened to us, put on us by other people, at some point, we become, in the natural course of events, we become culpable, responsible. There are too many circumstances where people that have had terrible situations have overcome those. And dare I say, our Lord Jesus Christ, no one has ever come into the world in a more humble way. And no one has ever exited the world in a more horrific fashion. And yet, without sin. There's this struggle that happens, I think, naturally in all of our lives. Ultimately, finding God and finding out that He requires more than just serving myself is something that I think that we all come to face at some point in our lives. God has chosen to connect heaven and earth and to have relationship with us who've been created in His image through Jesus. Through Jesus and through Jesus alone. You'll recall from Paul's address on the Areopagus in Athens, he says there clearly, God created us and intends for us to seek Him, to feel our way toward Him, to find Him although he's not very far from any of us. It's in him we live and we move and we have our being. That's not being spoken to relative to brothers and sisters. That's being spoken to the philosophers, to those of the intellectual community in Athens. That's everybody. He's not far from any of us. He's created us to seek him. And remember, he's seeking as well. It's not just us that he's created to seek. He's seeking true worshipers. John chapter 1, John begins that gospel, as you're familiar with, it's saying that God created and Jesus is God. Nothing was made without him. That he came in the flesh. John records in John 14:6, as you're familiar with, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Those are the words of Jesus. Jesus was chosen to unify heaven and earth. The Hebrew writer tells us that God spoke to mankind throughout the ages in various and sundry ways, but has chosen to speak with us through his Son in these last days. He, Jesus, is the exact imprint of God's divine nature. He's seated at the right hand of God in majesty on high. And through him, he reminds us, through him, God created everything that exists. And that tie to creation is so important. We know what Paul told those in the Roman church, those who perceive the world and all that's been created, the heavenly bodies, are without excuse. Why? Because they demand an answer. They can only be here. The patterns, the movements and the motions and the preciseness of what we see that's been created, the grandeur of what's been created demands a creator. In every life, my life, your life, every life, the life of people that have not named Jesus, I believe there is this encounter. There is this struggle that's happening relative to authority. And often it's not in the realm that we see. We're not dealing solely with the physical plane. There's spiritual battles that are happening all around us. You remember Elisha and the prayer to open eyes. There is a real life struggle that's occurring. The incarnation of Jesus, his life, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection, they demand a personal response. They demand a personal response. And while Jacob didn't understand that Jesus was that ladder, God saw him. God encountered him. God made promises to him in that dream. And later God wrestled him. And let's talk about those two encounters and some additional lessons and ideas and thoughts that we can potentially apply in our lives. The first that strikes me is that in that first encounter, Jacob, as he awoke from that dream, he was awed. In fact, in the passage, he uses the term, or in the English Standard Version, the word awesome is used to reference Jacob's verbal reaction to that dream. Jacob was in awe based on what had been revealed to him. The wise men that were involved in writing Proverbs and the Psalms, they account and provide insights to us. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom. The psalmist says, teach us to number our days, that we might gain a heart of wisdom. Being confronted with God and his awesomeness puts us in our place. Those that are awed, those that experience awe in the presence of God throughout Scripture, don't get into a mode of judgment and, there's just nothing there for me. There's no room, there's no place for anything but awe when we are truly awed. And I think he was awed in this circumstance. And when we encounter God and think about the magnitude of our culpability and all that he has done that's visible to us and all that's been revealed in Scripture, if we're not awed, if we don't experience or touch that at some point, we're going to continue in that struggle. We're going to continue in that struggle. But that should also lead us to experiencing some humility. Jacob, in this wrestling match, is asked his name. And don't miss the significance of that. What did the name Jacob mean? Supplanter. Someone who is going to take the place of, who's going to use trickery and deception to be self-reliant, but to usurp and take something that's not yours. When he appeared before his father to receive a blessing, did he misrepresent who he was? In this wrestling match, what does he want? He wants a blessing. I'm not letting go until I get a blessing. Do you think he would have gotten a blessing if he hadn't correctly confessed that he was Jacob? Is there more going on here than simply answering with his name? They wrestled all night. Why did they wrestle all night? I was always a basketball player, but I marveled at the wrestlers who were competing at in the same season because of the strength and endurance that they were involved in. Now, I could go and I could run all day long, but an Olympic wrestling match, if I'm not mistaken, freestyle wrestling match, 2-3 minute periods. Three periods? Okay. How long of each one?
3-2-2.
Oh, it's 3-2-2. Okay. Relatively short period of time. Why? There's some exertion going on. This is tough stuff. They wrestled all night. And what brought it into it? Touching of the thigh. If this was Jesus, if this was the angel of the Lord, this is clearly God is involved in this process. Why did it take more than a second? Was the wrestling match about a victory? Or was it about something else? Was it about completely emptying Jacob? I mean, to the point where he has no hips, no strength. He's looking at potential death in the face with his brother and 400 men coming to meet him on the morrow. Why did it go all night? I feel like he was tough to break. But this was about breaking him to the point, it was emptying him to the point that he could be filled up. I think this struggle is a real one, and it's something that we will all deal with. God is, in this situation, intervened and to the point of bringing him to a point where he had no other potential option. I think he did have an option. He could have reneged and things would have gone a different way. But God is emptying him. And what I find so amazing is that Jacob, in this circumstance, he's holding on. He's not ending this. He's not allowing this to end until he gets his blessing. And I think about myself, how many terrible circumstances, we all have different challenges and issues, circumstances that we deal with. I think about James and what James says in James chapter 1, consider it all joy, my brothers. How many situations when I'm in the throes of it, I'm in the struggle, am I holding on, waiting for the blessing, anticipating the blessing, asking for the blessing? Paul writing to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians 12, whoever thinks they stand, take heed lest you fall. With every temptation, God's going to what? Provide a way of escape. How many of us are holding on in those circumstances, waiting for that blessing, looking for actively that way of escape, but finding a blessing in the journey, in the match itself, not just the outcome, but in the journey, in the struggle. So that brings us again to his change of name. Jacob's name, he surrendered his name. And his new name, Israel. And depending upon what commentator you read, this either is focusing on the fact that there was some prevailing, a victory, or that God is ruling, and through God ruling, that paradox that now Israel is made it through that struggle, and God is ruling in their in his life, and then in the life of his descendants. Think about Joshua. Joshua, in Joshua chapter 5, encounters a man near Jericho. Man has a sword. Sword is drawn. And Joshua asks him, hey, are you on our side, or are you on their side? You know what the answer was? The answer was, neither. I'm not on your side. I'm not on their side. No. I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Sometimes we think it's us or them, us or them. I'm so glad God's on my side. No, we've got to be on God's side. If we're on God's side, then we prevail, then we win. It's not about trying to move God to our side. No, we've got to move ourselves to him. And I think that this encounter was about Jacob being abased and being brought to the point where he could be filled back up to serve God. He didn't let go. He didn't let go. And that brings us, as we wrap up here, brings us to again, back to Jesus. Jesus said, he called out actually to the crowds, according to Mark's record in Mark chapter 8, verse 34 through 37. He calls out to the crowd and his disciples about the need to take up your cross and follow me. If you want to save your life, you need to lose it for my sake. But if you try to save your own life, you'll lose it. I think that we see in Jacob one who was relying on his cunning, his treachery, his scheming. He after petitioning God for deliverance, he resorted to his old way of thinking. How can I appease my brother? I'm going to put together some gifts, and we're going to try to buy him off. And he ends up having this struggle before he meets his brother. And I think he's emptied. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but if you turn over to Genesis chapter 33, after he meets his brother, and there's a warm embrace and some discussion. In the last verse there, he erects an altar. He ends up offering worship to God, fulfilling the vow that he had made, and he calls that altar the altar, the God of Israel. He is taking ownership in an humble way of this relationship after having been emptied and going through the experiences that we've talked about. And now I don't see there being this separation. He's clearly placed himself under God's rule. He's allowing God to rule him, and that's the ultimate objective that this struggle that God has in mind for this struggle in our lives. That we're to come to know Jesus. We're to come to know who he is, and we're to respond to him in love for what he's done for us. So Jacob, again, I think was introduced to Jesus, and a struggle over authority in his life began. And that same struggle is one that we all face. God is the creator. Jesus is God. He came in the flesh, and we're called by him to surrender our lives for his name's sake. In that sense, our names are changed. We become Christians. We decrease. He increases. And all for the glory of his name. So hopefully you've been blessed and benefited by what we've talked about tonight and just remembering this familiar story. Next week, we're gonna consider Job. We're going to consider Job and the struggle that he had with God that was brought about by the incredible series of terrible events that were brought on in his life. And we're going to see how he questions God and how God interacts, and he is able to work through that struggle. God is able to use that struggle and bring about some blessing in his life. Thanks for being here, and Lord willing, we will see you next week or next Sunday as we gather together to offer our worship. Thank you for